In this unit we're going to cover dimensions in Revit, and I just want to start off by explaining the difference between permanent dimensions and temporary dimensions. Now, we've already come across temporary dimensions at the start of the course, but I'm just going to quickly explain those again. So let's just say we were putting down some new pieces of wall, hit the wall command, and you can see there in blue the temporary dimensions that help us to set out our elements within the model. Just cancel out of the wall command. Now if I go back at any time and select an element, it brings up those temporary dimensions. Now they're called temporary because they only exist when an element is selected. So if I deselect that piece of wall, you don't get to see those dimensions. So those are temporary dimensions. As opposed to permanent dimensions, these are elements in their own right. So here's one that's in this particular view, so I can click on it and I get the properties of the dimension itself. So permanent dimensions are the ones that you would use on a plan or a sectional elevation to tell somebody the critical distances, the angles, etc. That you want to convey to the person reading the drawing. So you actually want them to display permanently on that view even when no element is selected. So that's the difference between temporary dimensions and permanent. I'll just finish this part of the unit by saying you can convert a temporary dimension to a permanent one. If you look under this temporary dimension, there is a little dimension icon or symbol. If you go and click on that, it actually makes it into a permanent dimension, i.e. if I deselect the piece of wall, that dimension remains. Now if I click back on the piece of wall, notice it does have properties of a temporary dimension at this point, i.e. the value is in blue, so I can actually click on that value, type something else in and use it to control the distance between those two pieces of wall. So it's going to deselect the wall now, and it leaves that updated permanent dimension in place. Okay, so let's actually place some dimensions onto our view. So to do so, we need to go to the Annotate menu. So switch to Annotate, and the first panel you'll see there is for dimensions. Now there are lots of different dimension types here, and I'll quickly go through what each of these are for just a little later in the unit, but for now let's just look at how we place a dimension onto the view. Once you can do that using any of these different types is fairly similar. So I'm just going to start with the Align dimension. I would suggest that 90% of the time this is the dimension type you're going to be using, hence it's been put first in the panel. So click on Aligned. You immediately get a little dimension icon next to the cursor. And I'm just going to zoom in, make this easier to see. So let's dimension between these two walls. As I hover close to an element, you can see Revit is suggesting with a little dashed line where it's going to dimension to. Now where it actually picks up is determined by this setting here on the options bar. So at the moment it's set to detect wall center lines. You can actually get it to find wall faces, the center of the core or the faces of the core. Remember when we had the unit on wall makeup, we actually looked at the differences between the core faces and the wall faces. So you can choose which is the most appropriate there. However, even if you have it set on, let's say for example, wall center lines, you can force it to find other references simply by pressing the Tab key. So let's say I want actually the inner face of the wall, the plaster face. You can see it's naturally wanting to find the center line because that's the setting up here. But if I hover my cursor over where I want to find a reference and then simply press the Tab key on my keyboard, I can force Revit to find other references. So this setting up here is just the sort of primary reference, what it will go for first, but you can override that. Again, if I wanted the inner face of the cavity there, I could just put my cursor close to it, press the Tab key, and it would find it. So let's just go with the center line for now. So a single click finds the first reference. So I should have said, clarified a click on my mouse, a left mouse click, move on over, find the next reference you want a dimension to. Again, it's picking up the center line of the wall. A second click of the mouse, left mouse click, and it places that dimension. Now it will go on and create a string dimension. I'll talk about that shortly, but let's just go ahead and put this one dimension down. So at the moment we've got the value, but the dimension is sort of floating around, and if I move my mouse up and down, you can see I get to choose where I place a dimension. Now if you're happy with, let's say, the position there, and you want to place a dimension and go ahead and create it, you just need to do a third click. Now it's important that you don't click on any further references, otherwise it will continue making dimensions. So if, for example, I was to click, let's say here, it would create another dimension and keep adding to the string. If I want to simply put this down on the page, I need to make sure I'm not selecting any other reference, so I'm quite safe there away from the external wall. Another click with the mouse and Revit creates the dimension. Things to note here are the open padlock symbol, the constraint, so I can actually lock that. If I click it, I will force Revit to maintain that dimension at all times between these two elements. Really useful if you've got some critical dimensions in your model, let's say a corridor width, or this window has to be a certain distance away from the corner of the wall. We can dimension to it, then lock the little padlock there and place a constraint so that no matter which element we move, that relationship, that distance will always be maintained. Okay, if I switch back to the Annotate menu and remember the dimension panel at the front there, we saw previously how we've got a range of different dimension types shown on that panel. I just want to take you through quickly now each of those in turn and show you what they do and how they differ from each other. So start again with the align dimension. Just cancel out that box. It's called aligned because it automatically aligns with the elements you want to dimension to. So we saw how we could dimension between the walls there. So if we've got these two sort of canted walls in the plan, if we want to dimension between them, you can see it's automatically coming out perpendicular to the first reference and picking up the second one. So generally it aligns between the two references. I should say that throughout this tutorial, or this particular unit on dimensions, I'm using walls as the focus to dimension to. These tools obviously can dimension to any type of element in Revit, so just got walls up for the sake of demonstration, but you can dimension to anything, to detail lines, model lines, doors, windows, stairs, etc. So let's go back to Annotate. Let's look at the next one now, linear. Now this would be used, for example, where let's say we want the linear distance between this corner of this wall and this corner. So we don't want to dimension along its length. We want the distance either horizontally or vertically. So select linear, click on the corner. Now you might be able to make out, as I hover over there, very carefully, if you look, there is a tiny little blue dot. It's picking up the corner, the point. Only does that if you use this linear dimension type. So select once there, and you can see now, as opposed to that last dimension type we looked at, which was a line between them, this is sort of doing its own thing linearly across the screen. So let's get the second point down there. So now we can either dimension the vertical distance or the horizontal distance, just depends where we move our cursor on the screen. And again, like the other dimension, if you don't go and do further clicks on references, you can now just use the last click to place that dimension where you want it to be. So let's pop it down there. So that's a linear dimension type, really useful for setting out plans, particularly sort of site plans where you're setting out the corner of buildings with reference to maybe a triangulation point or something like that. Let's continue with the next dimension type, which is angular. If you used AutoCAD, many of these dimension types will be familiar. They're fairly standard in any sort of CAD package, but it's worth just running through them here to explain what they do. So angular dimension, let's say you want the angle between this wall and the horizontal wall there. So click on the first reference, click on the second, and simply a third click to place where you want that dimension to appear. Radial, as you might suspect, it gives you the radius of curved objects. Could be walls, could be, say, detail on model lines, could be curved spiral stairs. So let's do it with this piece of wall. Automatically picks up the center of the arc. Further click just to place that. And likewise with diameter, automatically gives you diameter and puts the diameter symbol onto the dimension. Okay, let's move on to arc length. So select arc length. Let's look at this arc here. So let's say we want the length of this wall between these two intersecting walls. That's when we'd use the arc length dimension type. So the first thing to do is tell it which arc you're interested in. Now just be very careful you select what you do actually want to measure. Do you want the distance, the length of the center line of that wall, or the inner face of the plaster, or the outer face? Remember to use that tab key if you need to force it to find other references. Let's actually go for the outer face of the plaster, so the final sort of face of the wall. Click there to tell it that's the arc you're interested in. You can see it highlights in blue. Now simply select the intersecting face, so the start of the arc, and we would actually want to measure to that face. Click there, and there is the arc length. And one final click, left mouse click, to place that dimension. Okay, let's move on to spot elevation. So I'm just going to switch to an elevation view. So spot elevation or spot height, again go back to the annotate menu. Spot elevation there only works in elevation or section, i.e. not in a plan view. And you can see as I hover over the model, I can find references points, and it can actually give me, if you like, the Z value, the height. Now this relates back to the levels that you've set. So let's say you want the, I don't know, the underside of that soffit there. Click on that. It's picked up the reference, and now you can actually go and place that dimension onto the view. Spot slope. Again, it will give you the slope of ramps, roofs, stairs. So let's do it on this roof as an example. So by default there, it's given us the ratio, the height to length of that triangle. Once you've created that, let's pop it back there. Spot slope. We can actually change its type. So with that still selected, edit type, and I will just go over dimension styles in a lot more detail a little later in the unit, but just to show you specifically with spot slope, units format, change it there. So at the moment it's giving you the rise per 1000 mil, but you can change if you want a percentage, if you want simply degrees there. Hit OK. If I just go ahead and select the dimension again, you do have a choice from that triangle graphic to toggle it to an arrow if you'd prefer, with the slope marked just above it. Okay, let's just switch back to a plan view, go back to annotate, and the very final dimension type we've got to cover is spot coordinate. Just like the spot elevation, which gave us the height, in plan we can do a spot coordinate, really useful for setting out. So again, just make sure it picks up exactly what it is you're after. So let's get the corner of the building there. So click on the reference and then click once and twice, and it will actually place a dimension and give you the X, effectively the X and Y coordinates. So north to south and east to west, based on your project coordinate settings. Quite often when you're dimensioning your views, you'll want to produce what we call string dimensions or multi-segment dimensions. So rather than just doing individual dimensions like that, you'll want a running dimension or string dimension across a number of elements. So really easy to do with Revit. Just go back to annotate. We'll use the align dimension type. Set that on all faces. So let's start on the outer face of the wall there. Find the first reference, the edge of the window, and all you need to do, instead of clicking anywhere to place the dimension, you just keep finding additional references. So the other side of the window, let's go to the center line of that intersecting wall, face of the door, or the side of the door, the other side of the door opening, and so forth. So you can see very quickly I can go and dimension along this wall. And lastly, the other face, the other end of the wall. A little bit messy there with that wall art, but hopefully you get the idea. And now, with no more references to hit, a last click to actually place that dimension onto the view where I want it. Probably be about there somewhere in reality. It looks a little bit messier, say, with the art there. So I'm going to place it down here. Last left mouse click to place it. And again, remember those padlocks, we can constrain any of those dimensions. So if any of those were mission critical, we wanted to maintain, for example, that dimension of 556 mil between those two windows, we simply lock it, cancel out there. Now if I were to come and pick one of those windows and move it, notice how it automatically now moves the other window, because we've told it that is an important constraint. That dimension has to be maintained. So don't forget those constraint padlocks, really useful when used in conjunction with dimensions. So we've created our string dimension, but what happens if we want to actually get rid of one of these segments? So for example, let's say we don't actually want to dimension the distance between the two windows, we just want an overall width for those two windows. So what we don't want to do is have to delete the whole string again and reconstruct it, and we don't need to. We can actually just take out individual segments out of this existing string dimension. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So you can see if I hover my cursor close to the dimension, the whole dimension string highlights. But if I just zoom in there near the 556 dimension segment, put my cursor back over the dimension and just tap my tab key on my keyboard, and Revit then homes in on a specific part, a specific segment of the dimension, I can now left click on my mouse and select just that segment. I'll move my cursor away. You can see that just that one segment is selected. Now I can hit the delete key on my keyboard and take that one segment out of the string without disturbing the rest of it. Now if I want to join that gap up, it's not a very realistic example, because you probably wouldn't want a dimension from the edge of the window to the next one. It wouldn't really be a useful dimension, but just to show you how that works, I can click on the one side of the string, and with this grip here, click, I can re-reference it. Just move it over, make sure the reference I'm after is highlighted, and let go of the mouse button, and now it makes that or increases the width of that dimension accordingly. So any of your existing dimensions, select them, and these grips midway along the what they call the witness line, these lines here, can be used to re-reference where you need. So if it's sort of face there, and then just let go. The grips at the end just control how close that witness line goes to the object that it's referencing. So we've just seen how we can take segments away from an existing string dimension, but what if we've created a string dimension and we haven't got enough segments in it? So you can see here we've dimensioned the main openings, but we've missed out the doors in the center, and we may also want to dimension to these intersecting walls behind. Again, we don't want to have to delete what we've done and start again. We can simply select the dimension, and now if you look up on the ribbon menu, there is an option to edit witness lines, and the secret is in there. There's a green plus and a red minus indicating we can add or take away to the number of witness lines in that dimension. So I'm going to hit edit witness lines, and if I hover over the dimension now, you can see there's a little dimension icon next to my cursor, and I can simply add in where I need extra dimensions, and you can see it's subdividing the correct segments accordingly. Let's pick up there, get the opening, and I think that will do it. So just click anywhere else to confirm, and finally hit escape or modify on the left of the ribbon to deselect, and there is your amended dimension string with the additional segments in. Let's now take a look at dimension values and how we can manipulate and edit them. So we've placed some dimensions onto the view. This is a dimension value. So if first of all you select this dimension, you can see there's a number of grips on here. Now we can control the position of all these elements, but say just for this part of the unit I'm going to focus on the dimension value itself. Now the value has a grip there, so you can, if you're very careful with your cursor, pick up that and drag it away from the rest of the dimension. So depending on your view scale, I mean that's a good example there where the dimension values can start to get a little bit busy, start to overlap, so you might want to tease out some of these, pull them away so it's more legible to read. So that's the first way to manipulate the value, is to simply pick the grip up and pull the value away from the dimension. Now if you then go ahead and actually click on the value itself once the dimension is selected, it brings up this dimension text control panel. Now let's go through each of these. Dimension value. So by default Revit is going to use the actual value, so whatever the distance is on that dimension, that's what it's going to put in there. There is an option there to toggle replace with text, so if you can't quite get your project to work and the dimension isn't what you expect, you can swap it to there and put another value in and fudge it. So if it's really meant to be 2234, put that in. And that's where I admit that I was just joking in the last sentence. You don't ever try and fudge the dimensions. You make sure the model is correct, and that's what happens if you do try and fudge it. Revit knows that you've put another value in and it's saying please don't do that. That box there, replace with text, is meant for things like to be confirmed on site, or to be checked, or to be confirmed by engineer, where you don't want to put an actual value in, you want some other description. So please take what I just said as a joke and a pinch of salt. Don't ever try and fudge a dimension in Revit. If you can't get it to work, actually work out why the model isn't given a dimension that you expect and adjust the model accordingly so that you do indeed get the correct dimension there. And likewise we can add text fields above, below, before and after the value, so we can still display the value. So for example we might want to be confirmed TBC after the value, apply that, and you can see 2116 to be confirmed. I'm sure you can envisage different text that you want to put in there, or to be checked on site or whatever. So you've got 4 options. You can use one, all of them, none of them. It's totally up to you. Click OK. So just very quickly run through that again, how you get to that box. So select the dimension itself. That gives you access to the constraints and the grips. And with the dimension still selected, another click on the value gets you to that panel where you've got that finer control over what is actually displayed here. in terms of either dimension value or additional text as you need. Now, dimensions are Revit system families, and as such you can go and create your own additional types. So if we take this one, for example, that we've just done, we can see that this type is a linear dimension style diagonal 2.5mm aerial. That's what it's been called. So just as we've done with other system families, if we want to create a new type, edit type, duplicate, give it a name. Revit will just add 2 unless you tell it something different. And just to give you a flavour of the degree of customization for your dimension styles, just very slowly go down the list of type parameters, so you can control exactly how your dimensions are displayed. Lots of different settings here, even the gap from the end of the witness line to the element, you can pre-configure that. Obviously you can choose the color for the dimension, the font, whether the text background is opaque, translucent. The units, you can override the project units and define what units you want your dimension style to be measured in or displayed in, including sort of trailing zeros and so forth. So absolutely every aspect of your dimensions you can control with a new dimension type. For those of you who have to produce dimension plans as part of your production information package, you'll know just how time consuming it can be to actually go around and dimension up your plans. I just want to show you a neat trick that Revit has got up its sleeve to help speed up that process. So here's a plan that we want to dimension up. So go back to Annotate, go to Align Dimension. Now we've already looked in this unit at how we can create string dimensions, so you'd think that that's what we do. We just start here and we go along and we pick up all our openings. We might want to pick up intersecting walls, the grid lines, and we just work our way around the plan. We can do that, but Revit includes a feature to greatly speed up the dimensioning of walls, and the trick is in this setting here on the options bar. Now at the moment it's set to pick individual references, i.e. we have to go with our cursor and actually tell it what we want to reference to. If you hit that little toggle there, you can see that we can actually swap it to entire walls. So if I swap it over there, now once you've activated entire walls and you hit the options button, you can actually tell Revit what you want it to detect or to dimension. So when we dimension our walls, we like it to find openings, and you can either have the center of the openings or the widths. I'm going to go with widths. I want to find intersecting walls. Those are walls that come into the back of the wall that we're dimensioning to. And I also want to find intersecting grids. So I want to dimension to grids that intersect with the wall in question. You can obviously turn those on or off as you need. Hit OK. And now if I hover my cursor over the model, you can see that it's actually finding complete walls. So I'll go ahead and click this first wall, and it dimensions the whole wall in one go, including all the things we've asked for: intersecting walls, openings and grids. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Not only external walls, internal walls. So you can see there it's much quicker than going around and creating all your string dimensions from scratch. So just very quickly, to make sure you know how to do that, annotate, align dimension, look on the options bar. There is the secret there. Swap it from individual references to entire walls. Once you've done so, that options button becomes active or available to you. Select what you want it to pick up, and then just simply hover over and click the wall. Click it once to select it, and a second click to actually place that string dimension, and then just move on to the next wall. And to bring this unit on dimensions to a close, I will just mention the concept of dimensions being view specific. We have talked about this earlier in the course, but it's a very important concept, so just very quickly go through it again. The dimension elements that you have created are annotation stroke detail items, i.e. they only exist in the view in which they're created. So for this demonstration we've been working in this level 0 floor plan. So if I switch to any other floor plan, those dimensions don't exist. Let's go back to level 0. If I right click and duplicate the view, I get a copy of the view. I can see the same model elements, however the dimensions weren't recreated in this view. Let's go back to our level 0. However, if I right click, duplicate with detailing, I now get another view looking at the same model, and a new set of dimensions have been created based on the other ones. I say a new set, they're not exactly the same ones, i.e. if I went back and deleted that string dimension from the original plan, went back to my second copy, they are still in place. When I duplicate with detailing, the new view has all the detailing and annotation elements created afresh, so they exist in that new view as separate items, so I can manipulate them independently. Likewise, I could take dimension there, drag it down, it would have no effect on that corresponding string from the original plan.
And that completes this unit. To get the most out of this training material, please take the complete course online at bimscape.com. Here you will find a complete learning management system that allows you to work through the course at your own pace. Comprehensive written tutorials provide additional information to that found in the training videos. Mark each unit as complete as you finish it and move on to the next. At any point you can return to any of the units you have previously completed to go over the material again. If you'd like to take this course online, please visit www.bimscape.com/Revit for details.